What's going on, everybody? Manta Musa here. So, today we're going to talk about this fool right here. Now, I don't know his name, nor do I care to, but I actually did see his channel before he started his grift. His name is, well, he's referred to as Modern Renaissance Man. Check out his channel, get out of an echo chamber and whatnot. If you haven't been living under a rock, you probably recognize this guy. He's been popping off for standing up against critical race theory, or as I like to call it, the right-wing boogeyman, because we know damn well they just, it's been taught for 40 years, and now you're worried about it, culture war much? But, and I gotta tell you, on the African Diaspora channel, they are tearing his ass up in the comment section. It's beautiful. The fact that there are blacks that aren't falling for this CRT scare gives me hope for the future of the black community. But anyway, in regards to this man, his grift has officially begun. So I'm about to play this clip of him shucking and jiving on Fox News, and obviously it's going to cause the genocide of many brain cells.
Because they're very invested in this whole idea that the nation was founded on the idea of systemic racism, that it's built into every single institution in America, even in the military. Folks are worried that this is something that they need to address within the military. And we just did a story about how the Navy is underprepared right now, but they're spending a heck of a lot of time on this. What do you think about that?
It's absolutely absurd because nobody really wants to get the real history of it. America was not founded on racism. Don't get me wrong, yeah, there was slavery going on, but slavery itself was not initially a racist thing. It never was about race initially. So to sit there and take it like America was founded on racism, it's a complete lie. Yeah, there was slavery going on, but slavery was going on in all the world. It never was a race thing, so why are we making it a race thing now?
Ty Smith, thank you for being here. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you for going on, but slavery itself was not initially a racist thing. It never was about race initially.
Alright, so you just heard him, right? He said initially slavery was not about race. That is word for word, verbatim, what he said. Now, he is absolutely correct. And before you start attacking me, stick around till the end of this video. I promise I will debunk this man as promised. Let me first start off by saying that I find it funny that he's saying that slavery wasn't initially racist. In case you haven't noticed already, he is a black conservative. And black conservatives, well, conservatives in general, constantly perpetuate the idea that the party switch never happened and that the Democrats are the real racists who supported slavery. Which is true, but the parties did indeed switch. So I want y'all to remember this the next time a conservative, especially a black conservative for that matter, says that the Democrats supported slavery. Use this very same talking point against them, then sit back and watch them malfunction. Another thing I would like to note is that he's using a trick. There's a trick he's using. Notice how he's speaking fast. So that way you'll think what he's saying makes sense. I wonder who he picked up this trick from. Oh, who else but my arch nemesis, Candy Girl. This man has ties to Candace Owens. He must be another one of her goddamn lapdogs. Aw, he looks so adorable in his Blexit shirt. Listen, whoever designed the colors for Blexit should have their eyes removed and then burned, okay? But anyways, let's stay on topic. This man has bumped uglies with the likes of Candace Owens, so it doesn't surprise me that they share the same deranged rhetoric of downplaying the effects of slavery.
Look back at your grandparents. Look back at what they did, what they lived through, the seeds that they planted so that you can afford to be in the circumstance that you are in today. If you are a Black American and you are breathing in the United States today, you are the luckiest among the luckiest of Black people that have ever lived anywhere on the face of the planet. That is an incredible statement. All of human history, the luckiest Black people that have ever lived on the face of the human planet are the ones that are living and breathing in America today, okay? If you understand that, and you should understand it by simply saying, Where would you like to live in Africa? For all of that hoopla about they took us from Africa. Find me a black American that will tell you they want to move back to Africa.
Okay, Candace, I see what you're trying to say. She's trying to say Africa is such a shithole country. America is way better. When the truth is that nobody's gonna move to Africa simply because, well, are you gonna move to a country where you don't even understand the language, the local life, the geography? You have no connections there. You have yet to find a job. I mean, you're going in dark. Nobody's gonna move to any country they don't know. Like, you think you can just move? You can uproot your entire life and just move in a split second?
I will listen right now.
Or Europe.
I'll book the flights for them. Right? For any person that says we were stolen from our ancestors, I, Candace Owens, am pledging that I will book the flights if you renounce your U.S. citizenship for you to go live back in Africa.
Well, bitch, you better book me a ticket because I want to get as far away from you as possible. But in any case, Candy Girl is one of the people that probably can't even name one country in Africa. So this statement really means nothing coming from her. But anyway, we didn't come here to talk about Candy Girl. Let's get back on topic. Alright, so he makes the claim that slavery is not racist, which is sorta true, but is a half-truth. And I'll explain why with indisputable facts. But let me first start off by saying that the concept of slavery is not a racist system on its own. This is true.
The institution of slavery was not based on race, and 2, whites as well as blacks were enslaved. The very word slave is derived from the name of a European people, Slavs, who were enslaved for centuries before the first African was brought in bondage to the Western Hemisphere. It was not only in English that the word for slave derived from the word for Slav. The same was true in various other European languages and in Arabic. For most of the history of slavery, which covers most of the history of the human race, most slaves were not racially different from those who enslaved them. Not only did Europeans enslave Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, Polynesians enslaved other Polynesians, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Moreover, after it became both technologically and economically feasible to transport masses of slaves from one continent to another, that is, to have a whole population of slaves of a different race, Europeans as well as Africans were enslaved and transported from their native lands to bondage on another continent. Pirates alone transported 1 million Europeans as slaves to the Barbary coast of North Africa. At least twice as many European slaves as there were African slaves transported to the United States and to the 13 colonies from which it was formed. Moreover, white slaves were still being bought and sold in the Islamic world decades after blacks had been freed in the United States. What marked the modern era of slavery in the West was the fact that, as distinguished historian Daniel Boorstin pointed out, now, for the first time in Western history, the status of slave coincided with the difference of race. But to claim that race or racism was the basis of slavery is to cite as a cause something that happened thousands of years after its supposed effect. As for the legacy of slavery in the world of today, that is something well worth investigating.
I'm sorry. I literally aged 50 years listening to this long-ass narration. But nevertheless, Thomas has a point. Slavery has been practiced since 1860 BCE. The first mention of slavery was in the Mesopotamian Code of Hammurabi. Now, this was early on in human history, so slavery wasn't at first as popular because it was a new adjustment to the hunter-gatherer's normal way of life. Slavery has existed all across the world. If you saw my previous video on why Corlys Valerion's casting choice makes sense, I note that the Romans enslaved many different races of people. Africans, Egyptians, Germans, Gauls, Berbers, Greeks, you name it. In fact, Roman families could even sell their own children into slavery, meaning the Romans were not above enslaving their own. That clip of Thomas Sowell was from a video titled Facts About Slavery They Don't Teach You at School. Public education is a mess, and we can fix it. But, I didn't have to learn about the different races that the Romans enslaved through school. I just learned it by turning on my TV screen. Take the 2010 series Spartacus, for example. For those of you that don't know, Spartacus was a TV show that aired on Starz. It tells the tale of the titular Spartacus, a runaway gladiator who led a slave rebellion and fought the Roman Republic. It's based on the true story of the actual Roman slave Spartacus. Many slaves in the show were different races and ethnicities. Spartacus himself was not a Roman gladiator, but a Thracian. His right-hand man, Crixus, a Gaul, and Omnimus, a Numidian. Anybody who believes that only blacks were enslaved has either never studied history, turned on a TV set, or is incredibly naive. That's almost as naive as believing that slavery doesn't exist today. Even in some parts of Africa, chattel slavery is still practiced. It's even speculated that more people are enslaved today than ever before in previous history. And that's saying something, considering that in previous history, 3/4 of the world's population was under some form of slavery or serfdom. So I don't understand why there's this assumption that people don't understand this. I've never read the Bible and I learned this from a goddamn TV show. But those who read the Bible, which includes the black community, will read about Moses helping the Jews escape bondage in Egypt, or the numerous stories that have elements of slavery in them. In fact, the Bible, even word for word, justifies slavery. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you, and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property, and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Leviticus 25:44-46. So it's true, the concept of slavery on its own was not inherently racist. There was an ominous hand that held this system together, and that hand was xenophobia, ethno-nationalism, and racism. So here's where the debunking begins. When thinking about slavery in the United States, it definitely does have anti-black connotations. The concept of race and ethnicity has been used to push and justify certain attitudes towards slavery. It's not only been justified through religion, but in the past was even justified through science. And that brings us into scientific racism. What is scientific racism? Scientific racism, sometimes termed biological racism, is the pseudoscientific belief that empirical evidence exists to support or justify racism, racial inferiority, or racial superiority. Historically, scientific racism received credence throughout the scientific community, but is no longer considered scientific, dividing humankind into biological distinct groups. It's sometimes called racialism, race realism, or race science by its proponents. Modern scientific consensus rejects this view as being irreconcilable with modern genetic research. So now I'm going to show you examples of scientific racism by showing you what actual scientific racists believed. Ancient Greek physician Hippocrates wrote about dark-skinned people being spineless cowards and light-skinned people being brave warriors. Does this man look like a spineless coward to you? Greek astronomer Posidonius believed that races that grew up in the southern parts of the known world didn't have enough blood. Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus categorized humanity into 4 distinct racial groups and believed that there were distinct biological differences between these 4 racial groups. German philosopher Immanuel Kant had his own writings on which races were good or bad based on stereotypes and not based on actual statistics. French naturalist Georges-Louis Leclerc and German anatomist Johann Bumbach both believed that humans came from Adam and Eve, who they believed were white. and that they degenerated due to too much sunlight and a bad diet. They believed that non-whites could become white again if they changed their location and changed their diet as well. German physician Franz Ignaz Pruner, through the study of different skulls, thought that blacks were naturally closer to apes. He also believed that the Irish were a non-white race. French Enlightenment writer Voltaire believed that each race had separate origins and that the blacks lacked the same humanity as whites. He even pondered whether or not blacks came from monkeys or monkeys came from blacks. American physician Samuel Cartwright wrote a book called Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race. In his book, he made a point that black people were mentally incapable of handling responsibility and freedom. In fact, he went as far as to say black people seeking freedom were mentally ill. He called this mental illness drapetomania. As you could imagine, this book was very popular among slave masters and plantation owners in the South. English sociologist Sir Francis Galton believed that the races should not mix, and the sterilization of people with undesirable traits, aka the inferior race, was necessary in order to strengthen mankind. He was a eugenicist. Another eugenicist you may know is Margaret Sanger, and we will be talking about Margaret Sanger in an upcoming video. One of the founding fathers, Benjamin Rush, and I'm not even kidding, believed that being non-white was a disease. He believed that those that were non-white were suffering from a disease. Let us also not forget about Rudyard Kipling. Well, he's not necessarily a scientist or a physician of any kind. Rudyard Kipling was a writer, and he wrote the famous poem, infamous poem, The White Man's Burden. The title of the poem speaks for itself. The white man's burden is referring to the moral burden of the white race, who are divinely destined to civilize the brutish and savage non-whites of the world. His words, not mine. Rudyard's rhetoric is very similar to Greek philosopher Aristotle's rhetoric. Aristotle justified slavery not on the basis of race, but on the basis of xenophobia. In fact, the term barbarian comes from the Greek word barbaros, which was used to refer to foreigners who lacked Greek and Roman traditions and didn't speak the language. Today, the adjective barbaric is most commonly used to describe an act that is brutal or cruel to the point of savage or primitive and uncivilized behavior. Aristotle used this to justify the slavery of the barbarians. As they were not accustomed to Greco-Roman culture, they were considered to be animals without any logic or reasoning, or as the Greeks would call it, logos. But to be clear, the main driving force behind slavery wasn't racism, but wealth and greed. However, the rhetoric that was used to justify these acts were rooted in xenophobia, ethno-nationalism, and racism. Scientific racism has been used to justify the use of slavery. And notice I say justify because as much as we'd like to believe that slavery was such a cherished system that not even one person in the past stood up against or questioned, that's not entirely the case. And I'll elaborate on that later. So as you know, Aristotle believed that barbarians could be enslaved because they lacked logos, aka logic and reasoning, and were foreigners who didn't understand civility, aka Greco-Roman culture. Aristotle goes on to take this a bit further. Another defense of slavery that Aristotle had was the idea that in order to be just, social norms must reflect what is natural accordingly. Society may practice slavery if there are some people who are naturally suited to be slaves. Natural slaves, as Aristotle called them. Now, anybody with a conscience sees that this is wrong. Anybody with a brain sees the term as bizarre, as there's nothing really natural about being a slave. Human beings, for the most part, are born with free will and the ability to make our own choices. There's nothing natural about being a slave. There's nothing natural about having a master, and there's nothing natural about being property. Property is an inanimate object. Humans are not inanimate objects. Humans have decision-making skills, self-control, critical thinking, emotions, memories, dreams, fears, and thoughts. It's like René Descartes says, I think, therefore I am.
I think therefore I am. Stop.
No, Billy, you stop. Nobody was talking to you. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that humans pretty much have all of the traits I just listed. So there really should be no push to rationalize enslaving another human being, even if they do speak a different language than you or don't share your traditions and cultures. So Aristotle is wrong. This deranged theory that there's a natural right to own another human being is no different than the theories that were surfacing during the transatlantic slave trade. During this time, the system of slavery reinforced the notion that whites, specifically European whites, were the natural born rightful owners of blacks, and that these blacks should be subservient. Africans were viewed as lowly, disposable, barely even human. Africans were always seen as subhuman in medieval Europe. In fact, many in medieval Europe thought they were mythical creatures. Alright, so we're now post-transatlantic slave trade, when the colonies, or America, won its independence from Britain. So America is now its own sovereign nation. So earlier, I paid lip service to the fact that not everybody was okay with slavery. Many whites felt guilty for the barbaric system of slavery. They knew it was wrong. I mean, just look at all the crazy scholars they had to justify these things. Using mental gymnastics, of course. So, a few of these whites were the founding fathers. The magnitude of this evil among us is so deeply felt and so universally acknowledged that no merit could be greater than that of devising a satisfactory remedy for it. For in a warm climate no man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him. This is so true that of the proprietors of slaves, a very small proportion indeed are ever seen to labor, and can the liberties of a nation he thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis. Not only do I pray for it on the score of human dignity, but I can clearly foresee that nothing but the routing of slavery can perpetuate the existence of our union by consolidating it in a common bond of principle. Now, it is true that the Founding Fathers held shame and guilt for slavery, and the reason I showed you these quotes is because I believe in the importance of seeing the good in people. But that's still not enough, though. They didn't end slavery. It is true that George Washington freed his slaves after he died, but you know what would have been marvelous? If he freed every single slave in the United States. Slavery ended years after their lifetimes. The 13th Amendment wasn't passed until 1865 by President Lincoln, and even he wasn't too thrilled about it, as people will have you believe. So, as bad as they may feel for slavery, that's still not enough. That still doesn't excuse what they didn't do. They don't get a cookie for admitting that one human being shouldn't enslave another human being. Imagine knowing something that you're doing is bad, but continuing to do it anyway.
Hey! Oh my God, you have chocolate macadamia nut. Oh, could I just try a little sample? Oh, I'm so bad.
Sure. You gonna buy a cookie this time?
Oh, I better just stick with the sample. I'm so bad. But at least I know I'm bad, so that makes me a little less bad. Or worse.
If you were paying attention earlier to that Thomas Sowell clip, which I don't blame you if you weren't, it was long as fuck, he notes that many whites were enslaved as well. This is true, to a certain degree, of course, because nuance matters. But I'm sure you've seen these memes online all the time. In case you didn't get it, those were Irish slavery memes. You know, there's that meme going around that Irish were enslaved too. And the Irish were enslaved too talking point is usually used to shut down any conversation about black African slavery in America because, you know, it happened to everybody, so stop complaining about it. But in any case, this is completely not true, and I'll explain why. While it is true white slaves did exist, notably on the coast of Barbary, where ruthless Muslim pirates would capture and enslave Christian whites, when talking about Americans, Whites were not enslaved in the same numbers as blacks, and even the whites that were enslaved didn't experience the same level of cruelty. In the New World, the whites that were enslaved under the system of indentured servitude. And for those of you that don't know, indentured servitude is a system in which one is forced to do labor and perform services for a limited amount of time in order to pay off their debts. Many indentured servants were in the position they were because of crimes they committed. In fact, their contracts expired within a certain number of years. The years the indentured servant would be given would depend upon the indentured's age. The number of years they have to serve could be extended as punishment or if the indentured servant violates the terms of their contract. Now, the reason I say that whites that were enslaved didn't experience the same level of cruelty as American descendants of slaves, ADOS, it's because there were far more laws protecting the indentured servant from a cruel master than there were laws protecting a black slave from a cruel master. In fact, the indenture itself, the indenture contract, was the property of the master, not the actual person under the indenture. And don't get me wrong, the Irish were heavily persecuted, especially in England, the Old World. In America, the New World, in the 13 colonies, many of them were indentured servants. But the thing that most distinguishes between a slave and an indentured servant is the fact that an indentured servant would one day see freedom when the indentured servant's contract is up. They receive their freedom dues, which is the payment they receive for their services rendered, whereas a slave would never see freedom, not unless they bought it, which was practically impossible. Being a slave was a lifetime job. Slaves would never receive any sort of payment unless you count free food, clothing, and housing. And by the way, keep in mind that those things are basic needs of livestock. But again, that's not to say that indentured servants didn't have it rough. The trauma that anybody faces can be passed down from generation to generation. This is called generational trauma. Not a very creative name. Now, just because generational trauma is a thing, that doesn't mean people aren't accountable for their actions or don't have privileges. After all, times have changed. But the issue is the eagerness to forget the wounds of the past. Even to the descendants of those enslaved at the Barbary Coast, wherever they are, I fully encourage them to address the traumas that their ancestors faced by those Muslim corsairs and pirates. I know it's not going to be easy, but it wasn't easy for blacks in this country either. They wanted to be free, and they had to fight for them. And the fact that they regularly enslaved white Christians further cements the point that I'm trying to make. Every single human being, no matter what race, ethnicity, gender, or orientation, was enslaved at some point in history. But my point is that the very system of slavery was justified and encouraged through theories of xenophobia, racism, the dehumanization of another human being, and ethno-nationalism. The Europeans that enslaved the Africans had multiple opportunities to enslave their own. In fact, it would have been way cheaper for them to enslave other Europeans. However, due to the technological advancements in shipbuilding, their greed got the better of them, and they decided to use this advancement in shipbuilding to enter an already existing market on another continent. Mix that with humans' natural instinct to be xenophobic and pseudoscientific theories on racial superiority and inferiority, and you have yourself the reason why slavery in America was inherently racist. Even if other races were enslaved, that in no way overshadows the slavery in the USA and its effects on ADOS, American descendants of slaves. Let's not forget, shortly after slavery, in another part of the world, there was a man who used race to justify dehumanization and atrocities committed on a group of people. So that's the case I made for why he's wrong. Say what you will about everything that's going on now. You can even have your dumbass opinion on CRT, but it is incredibly intellectually dishonest to suggest that slavery, especially in America, was not racist. American descendants of slaves, ADOS, is what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the Slavic people. I'm not talking about the white Christians enslaved by the Barbary corsairs. I'm not talking about the Romans, Egyptians, Greeks. I am specifically referring to Africans brought to America during the transatlantic slave trade. He said, and I quote, "Slavery was not initially racist." Initially. he only told you a half-truth. It is true, slavery, the system, is not racist. But I have just proven that although slavery was not initially racist, there was a particular group of people that made it about race, as well as xenophobia and ethno-nationalism. The majority, if not all of those names that I listed, all have one thing in common. They are all white European males. The amount of mental gymnastics they had to do to justify enslaving another human being against their will is astonishing. Slavery wasn't initially about race, but in order to keep it going, they made it about race. And because of their harmful rhetoric, it justified the enslavement, brutalization, torture, rape, and even murder of human beings whose only crime was being born in the wrong skin tone in the wrong part of the world. The point of this video is to shed a light on people who use this talking point in order to shut down any conversation about slavery in the USA, which happened in relatively recent history. It didn't even happen not that long ago. And in his case, on the very land he lives on. If you compare that to something that happened centuries ago, that in itself is mental gymnastics. You can't just pretend like racism wasn't an instrumental part in keeping slavery alive. And once again, my goal isn't to shame anybody. I'm not here to ask you to apologize for being white or that you need to atone for your white privilege because like I said, we all have a privilege. I know I'm going to sound corny for this, but at the end of the day, there's only one race, and that's the human race. But my thing is, if we neglect history, we're only doing a disservice to ourselves. If we want to move forward, we have to deal with the past. It's like Snoop Dogg says. You gotta always go back in time if you want to move forward. That's pretty much it for this video. Whew, it was a long one. Anyway, I hope I brought enough nuance to this. And of course, it's been fun debunking another clownservative. Like, subscribe, you know all that bullshit. Bye-bye!